So delighted that we're all here. My name is Joe Wolfe. I'm here at the Blavatnik School. And we are here, as you all know, I'm sure, to discuss a book by Marietta van der Tol, Constitutional Intolerance. Marietta was a member of the Blavatnik School until fairly recently. I can't remember the exact months and dates. When here, Marietta worked with me on the Alfred Landecker program. She was the postdoc, in fact, our first postdoc on the Alfred Landecker program. She's now moved to Cambridge, where she's also funded by the Alfred Landecker Foundation, but this time as a lecturer there on a 5-year research fellowship, also teaching in the university. So we're delighted to have this panel today. My colleague, Maya Tudor, will be chairing the discussion. Maya is Professor of Politics and Public Policy here at the school. And our two speakers, make sure I get the titles exactly right, Taran Kaitan, Professor of Public Law at the LSE Law School and Honorary Professorial Fellow at Melbourne Law School, and Nazila Ghania, Professor of International Human Rights Law at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights here in Oxford. So let me pass over to Maya to take us further.
Great. Well, we're so delighted to have Marietta back at the school, and I know that we have sort of had conversations around constitutional intolerance over the years, and it's safe to say that the topic is particularly urgent right now. So the way I thought we would structure this is that I'm going to talk with 15 minutes in dialogue with Marietta, for those of you who have not had a chance to read the book, about what the key arguments are. And then I'll turn over in turn to Tarun and then to Naz. You'll each have 15 minutes. And then we'll turn over to the floor. And that will be your opportunity to ask questions. So if you have questions, or you're thinking about questions, please note them and know that you'll have a moment to ask them shortly. So Marietta, I think it's always fun for people to hear about the origins of a book. Right? So I know this was part of your doctoral dissertation, but it doesn't exactly answer the question of what motivated you to write the book. It's, as I said, a hugely important question right now when we think about the power of constitutions to actually constrain. But you started working on this before it became quite as big of an issue as it is today. So can you just tell us a little bit about what motivated the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been a project that's been growing over a number of years. So as you say, it started with my doctoral research, which was thinking about questions of coexistence, of toleration in our own time, and sort of asking the question, what does it mean to tolerate? Because we live in a society with all sorts of differences, and sometimes we know how to negotiate those, and sometimes we don't, and that's life and that's politics. But what are the structures of the law that contain those conflicts, that contain those processes of negotiation, was really one of the questions that motivated my doctoral work. I think as I became a postdoc here in the School of Government, I think the question changed a little bit, because initially I'd been focusing on religious minorities and ethno-religious minorities, and also focusing on particularly Western European countries, so Netherlands, France, Germany. And I really wanted to write at the time about what are the legacies of toleration in contemporary constitutional law. Now, as I was developing this project into a book, a lot of these issues began popping up in countries like Hungary and in Poland, but also in Israel and also in Brazil and also in India and also in the United States. So it became a much bigger sort of set of questions, also around the question of how do we live with difference? Is it just that when we are all liberal and we have a liberal democracy, then we can sort these problems out? Or is there something more to it? Because we find that intolerance does occur both in liberal-leaning states, but also in illiberal-leaning states. And often in the context of illiberal-leaning states, there is also a story going on about democratic decline in general that makes the issue of intolerance not just incidental, but part of a much larger structural transformation of society, of governmental institutions, and even of the constitution themselves. So in Hungary, for example, the entire constitution was rewritten in 2011, and that has really set the stage for what Hungary is today. And I think what is important to see is, I think that what you were mentioning before, like how do constitutions contain our political behavior, and what do we do when those constraints sort of become looser?
Right.
And that is the big question that we have seen in Hungary for a long time, but we're also seeing increasingly in the United States, where obviously the current attention is, but this is not, America is not where this started.
Right, right. So I want to ask you about something you already mentioned, which is we see constitutional intolerance. It's one of the core things you talk about in the book, both occurring in illiberal societies and in liberal societies. And I want to hear a little bit more about why you think that is and how it relates to the key arguments of the book. And I'm just going to cite here, you say on page 3, the guiding argument of the book is that intolerance is not simply a potential undercurrent of illiberalism, right? Which is part and parcel of what you just said. It also has this constitutional intolerance is something we're seeing in liberal societies as well. So what do you mean by liberal versus illiberal societies? And what is the argument of the book? So if it's not simply illiberalism, what is it? Or what drives constitutional intolerance?
So I think there's two distinct questions there. And the first is, how do we talk about democracy in the context of liberalism and illiberalism? I think what a very useful distinction is that several scholars make is that we need to say, or we need to talk very precisely about what is ordinary conservatism, what is right-wing politics, what is illiberalism, and what is the extreme right. Often these get labeled together, but when you look more precisely, you will find that, for example, illiberalism is associated with the actual change of institutions, the actual change of laws, and the transformation of society into something that is reacting to the project of liberalism. Now, when you go into the area of the extreme right, that's where people are also willing or have an openness to use violence to effectuate those transformations. So it's a misuse of power that we find in that context. But I think what we need to understand is that most people are not born as illiberal or as liberal. They are responding to societal issues of their day. And these are the labels that we are using in our time to give expression to some of the awkwardness that I think we're experiencing in several societies. But I think what is significant about the liberal-illiberal divide is that actually there's a lot of people who might be conservative and might have reservations about aspects of liberalism as a project or as an ism. But it might not mean that they are against constitutional democracy or even against liberal democracy. And I think what we see in the current moment is that the far right is very effectively bringing together ordinary conservatives with more, even all the way up to the extreme right, in support of this illiberal project of transforming society. But it would be a mistake to say everyone who is conservative is therefore illiberal or is even extremist. I think we need to be careful to not do that, because it also allows people a way out when you've pointed out some of these, dangers. Now, the concerns of the book are also, and this is the second question, is what is then the actual argument? It really goes back to the assumption that we've had in constitutional law for a long time, that we had a modern state, we had constitutions, now we had democracy, and that meant that we had found a way of resolving some of the conflicts that we had before. Historically, we've understood those conflicts primarily as religious. Now, there's very few scholars who still say that these conflicts were primarily even religious, but religion had some, had some part in it. But it's also important to see how different structures in society can confer citizenship to certain groups or not. So religious minorities, for example, in the early modern period would not have been citizens. They would not have had rights, they would have had privileges that were temporary, that were dependent on whoever was in power. And it meant that it could change tomorrow, and it could change yesterday, and you could lose all that you had. Which means that you had no legal certainty, in effect, or a limited legal certainty. And I think what we are saying in the context of constitutionalism is actually what we want to give people is the full sense of citizenship. We want to give them fundamental rights, and they need to have legal certainty in enjoying those rights. What I'm showing in the book is that the story of constitutional intolerance is how some of these issues are resurfacing in our current debate, where we are challenging the legal certainty that people have with regard to the rights they have, because sometimes we say, oh, the law doesn't permit us to restrain or to limit this particular right, but we'll do it anyway, because we have a majority in parliament. So what will stop us? So legal certainty is challenged. We're also challenging the very rights of people, where we say some people effectively have more rights in public life than others, because, you know, we say that public space is something over something else. It might be neutral, it might be more general, it might, you know, be open to religion, but as long as it's not too ostentatious, as in France, for example. And then third, we're even talking again about citizenship and what it means to integrate and be part of a society, which is a conversation that has long focused on migrants, but even the project of the nation state was how do we integrate different religious, ethnic, linguistic groups in society in something resembling one political community. And I think that that project of what does it mean to share that citizenship is to find a way of coexisting long term, not just yesterday, not just tomorrow, but over a lifetime within those conditions of legal certainty, human rights, and full citizenship. So why is this coming back is one of my questions. Why, you know, if we believe that intolerance was something of the past, why is it actually, why are the structures of the way that we thought about toleration in the past again popping up? But also, who are the agents of this? And that is, again, coming back to the liberal-illiberal divide. In all of these case studies, I'm looking at how radical right parties are driving this change in each of those contexts, sometimes aided by center-right parties, not always. But in all these spaces, the radical right has a different impact, depending on particular legal structures in a particular country, but also on political opportunity, so what they can get away with or not.
Yeah. So one last question before I turn to Tarun. And I know we have two very eminent legal scholars here. So I'm going to ask the last question about the politics of constitutions, right? So I was just telling Tarun, I was reviewing a new book on India's constitution. And, you know, the argument in a lot of these new books on, and there are a couple on India's constitution, argues that it has been problematic to put in clauses which allow for the Constitution to bend, to suspend rights. But the counterfactual to that is that in the absence of those clauses, the constitutions without those clauses would restrain politicians bent on undermining constitutional rights. And so is it the case that constitutions have to bend or break, right? There's that dichotomy. Constitutions bend to reflect the politics of our time, or they break. Do you think that that's right?
I think we have to start with the very question, who wrote the Constitution, in what circumstances, and what were they trying to achieve? Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that, you know, I know the UK doesn't have a written constitution, but it certainly has certain fundamental aspects to its political life that are considered more or less timeless, although there's some historical sort of beginning point to this. But I think there is a mismatch in how we talk about constitutions in Western European states, where these have been written around the end of the 18th, throughout the 19th century, sometimes revised or amended into the 20th century. And often these constitutions took several decades to actually consolidate into what we now consider the final product, right? When we look at Central Eastern European states, some of them also tried writing constitutions. Poland was one of the first states to even have a constitution. That's something that we tend to forget on this side of Europe. But because of the history of the Russian Empire, the history of the Soviet Union, a lot of these efforts have been cut short, effectively. So some states were briefly again independent between the 1920s and the 1940s, but then again not until the 1990s. So I think there's an element of understanding that whatever we think of as the final product is also something that was written in the last 30 years. So it's likely that there will be some movement because there was movement in these other countries too. I think that is one observation. The second is there's of course a long-standing debate in America between sort of the people who believe in sort of originalist understandings of the Constitution and say, well, what did the particular drafters of the Constitution really mean? What did they really try to say? And can you to what extent can you read newer developments into this? So, for example, if your letters were meant to be private, does that then also mean for your email or for your WhatsApp or for your Telegram? Or do you need to change the Constitution every time that a new technological innovation is made? So that's one example. But of course, the other really contentious example, again from the United States, is the question, can you read the right to abortion into freedom of privacy, or the right to privacy? Hugely contentious. There's people who give different answers to this, and that has been true for a long time. But again, at some point, either the Constitution itself settles it, or certain precedents from Constitutional Court or Supreme Court might settle it. But the point is that these have some longevity to them, and they're not just sort of flipped one way or the other depending on who sits in these courts. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is not just a question of can we interpret some of these concepts a bit more progressively so that some of the technological advancements are included. But also just the very question of how different political parties look at the Constitution, what they want the Constitution to deliver in the here and now, and then try and find arguments to back that up, either in the past or in the near or distant past. So I think that is important to see, particularly because in what we call the culture wars, the law has become like such a focal point of a lot of these disputes. So if you can't solve something in your parliament, then maybe you go to court. Maybe you try and trigger a case in the particular district where you might find a judge who is favorable to what you're trying to achieve. We're not talking about ordinary constitutionalism at that point anymore. So I think the way that we ask this question, of course there needs to be some sort of flexibility, but does it need to be flexible to the point where it can just flip one way or the other? That is just not the idea of constitutionalism.
Right.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first to Marietta for writing this book, because it is an extremely rich, insightful, and beautifully written book. I would highly recommend it. I've learned a lot, so thank you. And thank you to the Blavatnik School for inviting me. It's great to come back to Oxford. Right, so I want to start by picking on the big claim of the book, which is the liberal illiberal binary, and Maya's, I think, starting question was also sort of targeting that, and it is in some ways it feels like an old-fashioned divide. It's a decade too old, right? The idea of established, stable, liberal democracies is gone, and we are all potentially autocratic. I mean, how long you have been a liberal democracy is absolutely no guarantee for what a one-term constitutionally shameless autocrat cannot do to the system, right? So I was a bit puzzled about the divide, and I thought a bit more. I thought, okay, maybe there is something meaningfully different about France and the Netherlands on the one hand, and Hungary and Poland on the other, and maybe the divide is more of a spectrum rather than a binary, and as a lawyer rather than a political scientist, I'm not sure whether the transition or the movement along the spectrum is sort of more, to use a Marxist term, sort of on the superstructure, or there's something deeper, more economic, social, etc. But anyway, that was the first point on which I got a little bit stuck. By the way, I should have said that I'm just going to throw a few pressure points. I have read the whole book in the last week because, you kindly said focus on a couple of chapters, but I found it so engaging that I read it all. The downside of that is that my comments are incoherent and they're kind of all over the place, right? So I will throw a few pressure points of thoughts that emerged from reading this fantastic book, right? The second was this idea of tolerance. I think there is a huge, there's a project waiting to be done on the pre-liberal idea of tolerance as well. There are hints of that in the book, and obviously the right, interestingly, there's a fixation with 1,000 years, right? There's the millennial thinking, which, and it's the same with Modi as well, right? He's talking about 1,000 years and whatever, right? So there's something about that, and obviously it has a history in Europe too, right? But I mean, this reaching out to the glorious past. But what's interesting is that is thoroughly asymmetric, in that it is only largely those who are attacking the foundations of liberal democracy who reach out to a usually made up or exaggerated idea of the golden past, right? But I've seen very little liberal constitutional scholarship that has gone behind the French and the American revolutions and tried to grasp a pre-liberal idea of tolerance, of constitutionalism. I mean, at the broad level of ideas, democracy, etc., we have scholarship in Amartya Sen's book, etc. But at a more precise institutional level of constitutional thinking, right? There's been very little, at least in my discipline, historical thinking about. I mean, Akbar in India in 1582 has not just a fully fledged theory of toleration, but as the emperor of India puts it into practice, right? Now, it sadly dies with him. But, why are Indian progressives not beyond sort of lip service, not drawing upon or, really digging into that inheritance, for example? So, and the broader point here is that there is a liberal fixation with modernity, which stops us from, I say us, okay, I mean, sorry, sort of, kind of liberals, right? Lapsed liberals, post-liberals, whatever. There is a temporal fixation with sort of modernity, bringing all these Enlightenment ideas to us, right? And I think I just wonder about the politics, the asymmetric politics of time and history. There's a beautiful chapter in the book on time, which I would highly recommend, and it really made me think about the role of time and the uses of time in politics. And I thought that may be a project waiting to be executed. Okay. Now, the second reason why I thought the book might had an old-fashioned flair to it, despite its brilliance and elegance.
Flair.
Yeah, well, there is a flair to it, but it's a lost innocent world which I think is sadly lost. Which is that it wants to return to that age of innocence where rights mattered, and its engagement with the idea of tolerance is almost entirely through the lens of constitutional rights and or values. And I wonder if the world is not, if we are not too far away from the remedial possibilities of that discourse, of that lens to respond adequately to tolerance or toleration within a rights discourse. And this is caricaturing because there's a lot more nuance. And of course, you talk about the pre-rights understanding of tolerance, especially in the Dutch chapter. But allow me the broad brush to get onto the alternative. How might we think about this problem if it was not a rights or value-based approach, right? So, in my starting point there is that the belonging question is here to stay. It's if you've not read it, I would strongly recommend Karen Stenner's book on called The Authoritarian Dynamic. She wrote it in 2006, and her main claim was that she's a political psychologist based on some experiments, claimed that in any sufficiently large human population, we should expect about a third of us to have an authoritarian predisposition, right? And psychology experiments, we all take it with a pinch of salt, right? But this is an experiment that many other people have done in many different societies and come to sort of relatively similar figures. And what she called an authoritarian predisposition was this idea that the normative unity, if you have that predisposition, you care about the normative unity of the group more than anything else. Right? You care about it more than your rights or my rights, your life or my life, or whatever. Right? And of course, it's a predisposition. It is triggered in times of crisis. It's triggered in the good times. It remains latent. It's triggered by politics. It can be triggered, she says, by the right as well as the left. These are exactly the same people. The people who will put their hands up to go and die or kill for the tribe, but they will also happily agree to massive redistribution of property if it is packaged as realizing normative unity. Right? So. If that is what is going on, I'm wondering whether doubling down on tolerance and difference is in fact going to get us very far. And maybe that we need to reach out to an even more old-fashioned progressive idea of solidarity. Not difference, not what distinguishes us, but what unites us despite our other differences, despite religion, etc., which is not a tolerance frame, right? It's a unifying fraternity, solidarity type frame. So what might that look like, right? So this is sort of putting my lawyerly hat on, and I'm thinking about the scholarship on integration, on centripetalism, on constitutional design. So I'm not a design skeptic at all. I think constitutional design matters. It's not the only thing that matters, but it's enough to slow things down. And sometimes in politics, that is all you need, some time to. Marie Le Pen is not the president of France because of the constitutional design of that system, and Trump is the president of the United States because of the design, right? So. So that's where, we all read things because of our own personal hobby horses. That's my current hobby horse, right? Thinking not from the rights framework, but constitutional design frameworks. I'm very excited about things like how electoral systems shape parties, right? The importance of ranked choice voting in just killing extremist parties because they are Marmite parties. They're nobody's second choice, right? A party like Reform or Fidesz or PIS would be your first choice or your last choice. And these parties, because they don't get anybody's second choice vote, are just excluded from the system and then they die out, right? In Australia is sort of a very good example. The choice of Australia, by the way, is also one of the only or most prominent Western polity, it seems to me, where the traditional party system has not collapsed, right? Is it a coincidence that it has
mandatory voting?
Well, it's absolutely right, mandatory voting. But I would think that AV or alternative vote or ranked choice vote is a huge combination with that. Mandatory voting absolutely keeps the poor as an important vote and makes the politicians responsive to them. Likewise, there's a great book on Afghanistan by Bashir Mobashir, who clinically shows how the collapse of Afghanistan is down to its design and the American insistence on presidentialism, where a parliamentary system with a different kind of design could have given the warlords and maybe even a part of the Taliban a stake in the system. So I'm just thinking about there are lots of other possible. I've just done a blog post wondering about. Whether progressives can think about an answer to the belonging question. So it's hard the belonging question is hard for progressives, right? Because you want an answer which is simultaneously internally inclusive of everyone, but also externally distinctive, right? So the trouble is that progressives, when they talk about belonging, give these universal humanist ideas, like Habermas's constitutional patriotism, which leaves no distinction between the French and the German liberal and whatever, right? And so that's the progressive challenge, right? How do you be internally inclusive? And I think one possibility there may be to think about behavior-based belonging. That exploring ideas of conscription for care work is something, you can, so this is very far from multiculturalism, right? Which I think ghettoizes and segregates communities, whereas you have your religion and do what you want with it, right? In public and in private, but the unifying dimension is sacrificial behavior for the tribe, and you do it when you come of age or when you join the community, right? So anyway, this is sort of the framing problem that I thought was it was staring me in my face, so I thought I had to scratch that itch. Okay, the third thing I'll say, how much time do I have?
You're pretty much out of time.
Oh my God, my third big point. Can I take like 1 minute to just make it?
Yeah.
Okay.
4 minutes from me.
Okay, I'll speak really, really fast. Okay, so
No, it's okay. Take the extra minute to.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this was a point mainly in chapter 3 about secularism and secularization, right? So, I mean, the one thing we've learned in the last 10 years is that every value, every idea, every right can be weaponized, will be weaponized, right? And whether it's democracy, whether it's equality, whether it's whatever, right? So, I mean, in India, you know Cecil Labode's work because you cited, right? So, secularism has traditionally meant a performative public inclusion of religious minorities, right? Where every prime minister would perform these public rituals of, very stereotypical, but wearing the garb of, whatever their own religion, would dress up like a Muslim, whatever that means, right? Or a Christian or whatever, right? Different points, go to the mosque. And only when Modi stopped doing it, we realized just how valuable that performative public, even like ideas of secularism. So when you worry about ad libitum and liberatum and, do these values mean anything? Can they mean anything? My worry is that, progressives have played this game for a long time, and you mentioned the abortion judgment, and you mentioned privacy rights. It can't be right for us, wrong for them. Right? So how do we think about, their colleagues have talked about abusive constitutionalism, and basically what's abusive is the use that you don't like, right? And that cannot fly. So how do we think about playing with ideas, pushing them in certain directions but not others? Because I don't think it's viable to say that some change is okay but not too much, or change in one direction is okay but not in the other. I have a lot else to say, but I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really good. Naz, can I turn to you?
Of course. Let me also add my thanks to Marietta for this rich work and allowing me to engage with it, and this opportunity to respond to it. Your monograph draws us all into the relationship between minorities, the Constitution, and the rule of law, amongst other things. But I want to focus on this, and it relates to a rich literature also on the domestication of international human rights law in a unique and interesting way. Tarun just said human rights are old-fashioned, but I'm going to stick with it regardless. because we have to, because there isn't the alternative that we can use to hold states accounts to, but point taken. The fact that you've delved into this question with such a thoughtful methodology, the learning of new languages, I'm in awe. I've never learned a new language in order to write a book, so that's great. The visits to the countries to sort of get a temperature, a sense of it, speaks to its richness. At the end of your chapter 2, you challenge the creation myth of the modern state. The freedom and equality it once proclaimed remained contested and cannot be seen in separation from new forms of othering in the nation state, you say. You insist that we ought to challenge the naive projection of the modern state as the inevitable mediator of peace, liberty, and equality, and that profound issues remain for the modern state on toleration, coexistence, and the role of constitutional law in containing differences, religious and otherwise, that you brought up in the discussion with Maya. I totally agree with it. And it's also the dominant form of governance in international law, which means that we can't bypass the state in calling for accountability, but we have to always problematize it, especially the multiple forms of othering that persist, the innovative, devious, creative, cynical ways in which this multiplies and expands, and the efforts to which states go in trying to camouflage their discriminatory intent or exclusion of minorities behind ostensibly neutral laws, populist slogans, and general policies. It's very, very widespread. Perhaps you would also refer to international human rights law as a creation mythology, in that but nevertheless, regardless of their violation or their respect, they remain legally binding on states. But the challenge of the realization of human rights standards relating, for example, to freedom of religion or belief, to minority rights, to equality and discrimination, are prominent throughout your study. And you refer to it in one place as being sort of particularly complex and challenging. Yet, is it challenging, or is it that they purposefully want to avoid respecting it? But in any case, they're clearly under assault in so many contexts. Rather than addressing the academic literature, I thought the best thing would be to offer a perspective from about what constitutional intolerance looks like, from trying to engage states and non-state actors as special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, where it's part of the daily interactions and the work. And as a special rapporteur, especially on freedom of religion or belief, which is that mandate has existed for 40 years. Thankfully, I've not been in it for 40 years, just 3 years. But there are a number of pushbacks that come from state authorities when, for example, presenting thematic reports at the United Nations General Assembly or Human Rights Council, in country missions with a whole variety of government authorities, and also, then especially in the country reports that are produced on the back of those missions. And then, of course, there's the engagement with civil society actors, and in this mandate, with religion or belief actors, representatives, communities, and leaders. Time and again, what kind of resonates constitutional intolerance and what states bring up. Time and again, they refer in engagements to the constitutional provisions for freedom of religion or belief as if that were sufficient. They don't welcome any critique or pushback on the constitutional provisions and the gaps in them in relation to their own human rights obligations, and they insist that it doesn't apply to non-nationals. So what I mean is that, in every state report, I'm sure every mandate, when you present your report on a thematic human rights matter, the states come back and they say, thank you very much, this is Article 3, this is Article 6, this is Article 19. And that's it, like, hooray, we've ticked that box, we obviously fulfill everything that is to do with that human rights. It's just, it's decades and decades, and still that seems to be the rule book that they bring out. And they repeat the chapter and verse, and then when you're in the country and you're engaging with authorities, they again refer to chapter 3, chapter 6, and chapter 19. I wanted to flag the question of constitutional review, but in a different way to how Maya was referring to it as being a challenge. There are many countries where there is a constitution, it allegedly upholds human rights, but there is no constitutional review. So once you've ratified the new human rights treaty with all of these new obligations, then the judges say, we can't implement it because there is no, it hasn't been domesticated, it hasn't been brought into the law. And the constitution remains untouched. There is no law that brings it, activates it at the domestic level. And so, it's totally performative. The ratification of the whole human rights instruments can be stunted at that stage. So when it comes to constitutional review, of course, the question for minorities is who decides and whether minorities have access to it or whether it's been captured by a state that wants to exclude it to minorities. What about constitutional provisions? Well, any critique, as I mentioned, of constitutional provisions and how they fall short of international human rights obligations of that state are really not welcomed, as if it's beyond the purview of an independent expert on that topic to merely observe and highlight it. So, for example, in Sweden, I heard time and again that the constitution gives absolute protection to freedom of religion or belief, but actually it doesn't take much to look at it and realize that it's the having and adopting of freedom of religion or belief that it is absolutely protected, but not its manifestation. So, you know, a bit of a major gap there. And secondly, when it comes to Hungary and Zambia, of course, questions had to be raised about reference to the Christian character of the state and what it implies. I mean, more than that, what it implies in practice for actual enjoyment of human rights by others on an equal basis. Now, thirdly is the shocking reality that many constitutions state that the constitutional standards don't protect non-nationals. So how easy then it is to denationalize the whole populations, make them stateless. And what about the migrant populations? So they might be referred to as temporary migrant workers, but they may have been there for 3-4 generations. So what happens there? So next, let me move on to the actual realization of the constitutional norms. Your book is bold in that it zooms in immediately on the actual practice and enjoyment for minorities. The heart of the matter in relation to the domestication of international human rights law, and freedom of religion or belief in particular, is that, you know, it's a very good litmus test of the reality on the ground. If minorities, if those that are disfavored and othered, actually enjoy human rights on an equal basis, that can tell us a lot about the system as a whole, the obligations and their domestication. Since your monograph is not apologetic about including the political context, and I welcome that because it allows you to engage more questions, and you know, many other books would sort of shy away from the historical and the political, but it allows you to delve deeper into how the political undercurrents, or even overtly, how the political pressures are impacting legal realities on the ground. And as you say, transforming the legal concepts themselves, sometimes literally, sometimes in interpretation. You illustrate well in your case studies that there is state capture of the institutional framework, the mindset of those. Then I see, you know, on the ground in the mandate. It's also the mindset of those who work in the state institutions, the politicization and exclusionary approach that is normalized as being just what should be in a particular context. Oversight bodies that were originally there, intended to be independent and guarantee rights, become actually the buttress exactly the exclusion. So your term constitutional casualness really resonated. And I agree with Tyrone that you have a very elegant way of writing it. Now, let me move to, I think the final point I'm making is that the thread in your monograph about the championing of religious freedom by right-wing movements. Yes, of course, it seems self-evident and correct to say that, but they are likely to realize only too well that the championing of freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as understood in international human rights law is unlikely to serve them well. So some are playing catch-up in coming to that realization, sort of wanting to take away freedom of religion or belief or religious freedom from its human rights context, and be applauded for championing that, but outside non-discrimination, equality, inclusion. But there are interesting dilemmas that arise. So one account that I heard from a number of different interlocutors in Hungary was that the deep engagement of churches in service delivery was not welcomed by some of the church actors themselves. So having really got deeply into running childcare facilities, schools, universities, health facilities, homes for the elderly, and so on. I mean, let's, in case you haven't read the book, but in Hungary, if more than 50% of the parents of a particular school vote for the school to go over to the church authorities, it happens. And that obviously has implications. And in the country I was saying, well, what is the consultation with the teachers, the head the other parents and what are the implications for the children. And it was like, it's 51%. It's been decided and the rest can take care of itself or can be disregarded. But those that have now suddenly got deeply into running these facilities, some of them were saying this has moved us away from our core spiritual mission. And they were no longer very keen about it. So I'm not trying to make a very sharp distinction, and nor do I think they were trying to make a very sharp distinction between faith and action or belief and service, but that there was just so much complexity in this that they felt that now they didn't have the focus or the resources to carry out their core mission. So to what extent do you think that over time this will run its course and that it will be dropped and run out of steam, that right-wing movements want to champion or be behind religious freedom? How much recasting, redefining, and selectivity will be required for this to remain a helpful political slogan over time? Another example that a colleague brought to my notice a couple of days ago was, the number of right-wing movements championing religious freedom that actually end up bombing or restricting access or interfering with some places of worship, and sometimes their own places of worship. So, that honeymoon doesn't seem to last very long. So what are your thoughts on that? I'm very curious whether you're going to apply this lens to other countries and other contexts, whether if you were rewriting it now, you would have sort of many updates. I suppose you would, for France, for Netherlands, for Poland. And finally, to what extent do you think security or the sense of security or fear of insecurity is underlying all of this? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're halfway through our time, and I'm conscious that we want to get people asking questions. But so Marietta, I don't know if there's just a few things that you want to pick up and respond to. I know that you'll have opportunities to continue the conversation, but so if there's just something a few things that you want to respond to, please take the time.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. Tarun, I'm kind of happy that the liberal-leaning versus illiberal-leaning divide gave you such an edge, because it's actually one of the things that I want people to think about when they read this book. I think I started from very common assumptions that people make about these countries, and I think I wanted to meet my audiences there. Partially because some of the Christian right look to Hungary and say, well, isn't this a wonderful example of what a Christian state looks like? Whereas other people would say, well, it's the epitome of all that's against democracy, liberalism, etc. It's also what has informed my choice to write in the context of Hungary about what happens with the Christian churches, rather than any other topic. I could have written about LGBT inclusion, about what's going on with Roma children in these schools, who often, sort of have to be at the what remains of defunded public education after these schools have flipped to the church. But I chose to write about religion to do several things. One, to hold a mirror up and say, is this actually what you're looking for? So that's one of my audiences. The other thing that I did was put in a chapter on Poland, and there I could again have chosen to write about several topics, but I chose to write about what was known as the LGBT-free zones. Also as a way of highlighting that when you start eroding religious freedom, it's very difficult to do that without eroding other rights and vice versa. So what I wanted to do is get behind the sort of religion versus sexual freedom divide, which I think is, very polarized and not very helpful, and often leads to the sort of mutual erosion of these rights, as is also described by Frank Ravitch in the book Freedom's Edge in America. So that was a strategic decision, but it was also really to make people think about what is it that one is unhappy about in liberalism or in illiberalism. So often illiberalism becomes the catch-all term of everyone who we think is intolerant, who might not like gay people, who might not like feminism, etc., etc. But I think what I wanted to show is that it's oftentimes not actually about these preferences that might be different. It's about the institutional changes and transformations that get justified because of these issues that have divided us. And one of the things that has really caught my eye while doing research in Hungary was how some of these topics will come up and polarize society and the media right in the moment that the government is trying to do some other business.
Yeah.
And we need to pay attention to the other business. And I think maybe the strongest example of this was when Viktor Orban spoke against racial mixing in the context of the Carpathian Basin. And all the international media were writing that, oh my goodness, Viktor Orban is like, this is very close to what Hitler was saying about race. And that was exactly what was intended with that kind of conversation. And all that energy doesn't go into the other things that he was talking about. So I think we have to understand that we are sometimes led by donkeys, and that we're sometimes, not wise enough to see through it. So I think that was one of the choices that I made. But then also the question is, what does a constitutionalism look like that can balance us out again? So it's not so much for me about, if one side cannot do it, then the other side should also not do it. Well, that's true. But I think there's something deeper here about how, we have come to a place where we think we need all these constitutional repertoires, where it's changing a constitution or adjusting the interpretation of a constitution, or to say something that's in the constitution that's not even there. How that is really veiling deeper-seated issues about coexistence. And again, for my audience of what I hope some conservative Christians who might lean to the far right and see this as a solution for their problems, what I hope to do with this audience is to show, one, that actually when you support the erosion of democracy as a whole, it will eventually come at the cost of your religious freedom. Also, that even if you get temporarily, and this speaks to your point, if you get temporarily privileged, at some point people's patience is going to run out. Why is my tax money put to a church that I don't go to, for example? That's a question that will come up, and I think in Hungary it's going to be, as and when this change will happen, it will be a painful change, I think, for the churches as well. I think that said, I think when I say what is then the balance that we need to get to, I don't think I necessarily wanted to prescribe that in the book, but what I wanted to do is to highlight how we need to learn to live with, different understandings of what space is, what public space is doing, different ideas of what society is and isn't doing. I think of some of the Christian communities that I grew up in, for whom, many aspects of the liberal project were seen as a direct attack on who they are. And for whom religious freedom was sort of like the thing that made it palatable. Yeah. And they were able to function within the structures of constitutional democracy because they had the religious freedom. And I think what we are underestimating is how the push for inclusion is alienating that part of the voter base that has, in Europe at least, and I would say in America, also upheld the more sort of traditional conservatism that, at least in Europe, has supported the democratic stability that we've had after World War II. So what are we doing with our conversations that are so polarized? What are the sort of deeper-seated problems in society that are coming more to the surface because we thought that these were resolved? I think also of the Catholic Church, the Second Vatican Council, for Catholics with whom I am regularly in conversation, what they say, what is at stake in the current moment even, is how the Catholic Church orients itself on the Second Vatican Council, which was a moment in which it affirmed religious freedom and sort of appeased itself with the project of democracy and constitutionalism. We're talking about the 1960s, it's not so long ago. So I think it is important to see that this is an issue that might come up when these communities are aggravated too much. And I'm not saying don't have these difficult conversations, but we need to be aware about how these might spill into the larger questions of our democratic stability beyond the mere issue of, say, the freedom of schools or the ways that we work out inclusive citizenship.
Great. Let's turn to questions. Who has a question? Alisher.
Good evening. My name is Alisher. I'm doing my Master of Public Policy here at Blavatnik. So my question is related to, again, applying Constitution with respect to ensuring freedom of religion or belief. So in many cases, when it comes to this topic, we mainly focus on state acting against minorities. But in the case of many Muslim majority states, for instance, it is the other way around. So it is usually state having a very secular state, usually the type of secularism that is equivalent to French type of secularism. And the same constitution usually has, article about that this state is actually secular, and it has also aspects of, let's say, ensuring freedom of religion or belief. But in many cases, these Muslim majority states, they give a preference on ensuring security over freedom, and it is usually state acting as a minority, abusing power and also abusing this freedom of religion, which is religious, which is actually majority of the people. Yeah. So the question is, what is this step-by-step approach to actually eliminate this problem, also having in mind the state's security concerns in Muslim majority states? Thanks.
So thank you for that question. Obviously, this falls outside of the remit of the book, so I'm not responding from within the book. But I think what is worth stating is that we've often made a distinction between what we call tolerance, as in how different groups orient to each other, and toleration as what is the role of the state in containing these conflicts that might arise. I think what I would say is that constitutional design here, insofar as secularism is part of the constitution, we tend to make a big deal out of this, what sort of model of church-state relationships a particular country has. But it doesn't tell us an awful lot. I think what we need to do is actually look at policy making and legislation that gives meaning and some context and meaning to what these relationships may or may not look like. I think it is very difficult to make a generalization here about Muslim majority countries. I think what I would say is that there often is increased tension when there are several groups that are more or less living as separate social entities. It's not miles away from how Europe was for a long time, with lots of ethnic differences, linguistic differences that have partially been the edge has been taken off by the project of nation building. But I think what the Constitution does well is containing these issues when citizenship is equally distributed, but also when decisions are made not just with having in mind, have you got 50% plus one, but how do we cater to the needs of these different groups? And often you find that when you have a particular ethnicity or a particular religion that is in a relative majority, they can monopolize some of the resources that then minorities don't get. And that's where a lot of these problems begin to arise. I would also say that these problems are usually not the result of just one policy or just one constitution. They can be, they kind of grown through generations. There may have been several moments where particular incidents have instigated, heightened concerns about security. That's maybe all true, but I think we have to look at the longue durée here of how if people live together or not, how are resources divided, or do people have legal certainty, are they losing everything when things go wrong, which happens still in lots of countries around the world, despite all our efforts to talk about religious freedom and other forms of freedom. So I don't really want to make a generalization here about Muslim majority countries, but I think these structures can help us to make sense of why some of these conflicts arise, whether it's in a Muslim majority state or in a Christian majority state or in a Hindu majority state. We spoke briefly also about Modi in India here. So I realize that's maybe not the answer that a full answer that I would like to be able to give, but that's where I would start.
Other questions? Yeah.
One there.
Start there.
How do you do? I sometimes despair at the collapse of international law and respect for human rights internationally. And I see everywhere politicians wrapping themselves in their national flags, which leads me to feel that the United Nations now is in exactly the same place as the League of Nations was in about 1936. And if we cannot bury our national differences and agree things, we are seeing wars break out already. Conflict resolution will become increasingly difficult. And so these rogues who leaders need to be called out at every instance when they flagrantly don't observe international law.
Do you want to comment? Is there anything you want to comment on there? Or
It wasn't really a question there.
yeah.
But, you know, yes, on the one hand, it is important to call these leaders out. At the same time, I also wonder about the extent to which I was mentioning before how some topics can distract us from other things that are going on. Like, I think we need to be very careful when we think this is the main thing that's going on in a country and it's not actually the main thing that's going on. So that maybe as a footnote, but otherwise I agree. Yeah.
They're using their own laws to ignore international laws. Human relations.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges here with Hungary is that, you know, Hungary has been violating the rule of law in many, many respects in the last 15 years. And the question has been, how do you contain that? And one of the instruments that was used within the EU was that the EU Commission could say, we will freeze certain funds until you've made amends. Now, that works up until a point, because if the pressure is enough for the government to make changes, that can then work out in a fairly positive way. But if it doesn't, actually it can harm the population to the point where the population will look at the international organization, whether it's the EU or the UN, and say, well, who are they? Why are they doing all this? This is hurting us, it's not making any change. And it might actually aggravate the situation in that it allows these, like in this case, the Fidesz government to build on that resentment to continue doing what they were doing anyway. So it is, it's not as simple as we apply some pressure and then it will, you know, so, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but this is just one example. In Poland, with the LGBT-free zones, it worked. So the pressure from the EU Commission led to the annulment of some of these decisions, or the withdrawal in some local contexts. And this was mostly because local municipalities didn't really want to lose out on so much money. It wasn't that important after all, this whole issue of LGBT rights. But I think it is always a difficult political decision, and you know, students who would sit here in this room would have to wrestle with some of these things all the time. Like, at what point do you take action, and at what point do you take the pressure off? Because actually, taking action can aggravate the first problem that you were trying to address. So.
Yes. Is it on this question?
Yeah,
Because okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes.
So actually, in the book, Marietta has a very nuanced take on the use of liberal freedoms and rights to often shut down religion-based arguments in the public sphere, and I think you're not full-throatedly welcoming of that sort of liberal closing of doors, right? One of the most beautiful passages in the book, if I can read a line, it says, where you talk about the metaphor of the door. You're talking about thick publicness. I love this paragraph, right? Where you say, turning to the image of the front door as demarcation of private space on its head, can we begin to understand public space as that space with multiple entrances, right? And front doors as entrances into this commonly shared space. Can we conceive of public space, a space of encounter with those we may have thought of as other, allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable in that space and possibly even misunderstood? So, and that, to me, is basically at least a questioning, if not a rejection of Rawlsian public reason, right? To say that, the next step you don't take, which I think is the logical corollary, is an embrace of a much more perfectionist idea of liberalism, which is not scared of religion in the public domain, that admits to value pluralism and much more sort of ratio and variety. And I think that is a huge strength of the book, and would therefore complicate. I mean, international human rights law may, in a certain conception, may be part of the problem and not just the solution. Right? Is that the right
in
way
the
to?
performative sense, at least.
Yes.
There's certainly, I can see now the bridge with the comment that was made. I think to me this was a really important metaphor, because when I was in Hungary, I was in the history museum, and it has this exhibition with the doors, and here it signifies the doors of good governance and enlightenment to sort of the right ways of governing. Now, that was slightly ironic given that I was there to research all the things that weren't going well in this country, but in Central Eastern Europe, the image of the door is really, really profound. And I think I found it beautiful to use that as a way of, it's not just an entrance for people to be who they are, but it also gives us an insight into their world of how they understand the world, how they feel about the world, how they think about the world, what they believe about the world. It goes much beyond just having a religious symbol. It's more about more fundamental sort of openness to the frames of references of people that we consider as other to us.
I'm going to come to Joe for a question.
Well, thank you. I want to continue this a little bit, because I mean, the comment made me think that what we want to do is stand up to the bullies, but that's what they want to do. Well, that's what they say they want to do. So if the EU is putting pressure on the government, then suddenly the EU is the bullies. And it's just as easy for them to want to stand up against what they perceive as the bullies. And so it's not a straightforward matter to say, you exert force and you're going to have that. Because most of us, I think, when challenged, our reaction is to stand up, at least at first.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
It's proper majority voting, not unanimity, then you just have to put up with it.
Could I just briefly on that? I think, this whole anti-liberal project, it's not just a story of Central Eastern Europe, it's also a story of Russia, and the way that the Kremlin weaponizes the anti-liberal sentiments to, prop up some of the narratives that the far right is already propagating themselves. So for them, the bully is, again, Europe, it's NATO, it's America. It ties into bigger questions of world order, even though, when specific issues come up about whether it's how funding is allocated or not, or which minorities are accepted or not in public space, we might sometimes forget how this is feeding into a completely different view of what the world should look like.
And so I thought you were going to mention America.
Yes,
and in the US, the judges are now the bullies.
Yes,
So the judges who are standing up to the administration. So if you think you're in the right, then you're going to push back in whatever way you are. I mean, it is partly complicated because the right does seem to be using liberal language to defend projects that are not liberal projects. And so you worry about, or you wonder about how sincere the arguments are. That is, they know what they want to achieve. And so they use any method or mechanism or the language of the enemy to try to achieve what they want to achieve. But actually the question I wanted to ask was about this idea that the liberal-illiberal dichotomy is old-fashioned now. So I'm wondering, so this worries me a little bit, I must say. And I'm wondering what exactly is old-fashioned here. So is it the dichotomy that's old-fashioned, i.e. that there's more of a continuum than or the terms of the debate is old-fashioned? So
The former.
the former.
That binary way of seeing the world as, and this applies to democratic, authoritarian, I mean, part of the project is provincializing West Europe, right? I mean, that is what you have done beautifully to show how France and Netherlands are not some liberal utopia either. And I think it's challenging those stark differences. Even North and South, these are all sort of too stark.
Yeah, I mean, there was this argument in the late 90s, early 2000s that proved that two liberal states can't go to war.
Right.
Democratic
so
peace
quaint,
theory.
and it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
So the argument of the liberal peace, so the version of it I remember is two long-established democracies,
Democracies,
don't
yes,
go
yes.
to war.
Maybe it
And I'm
was.
still not sure if that's been refuted.
No.
So has it been?
No.
There's not been a
Has
law
not been
between
refuted.
two.
Are we changing the
well-established-
definition of long-standing?
Well, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
And
So it does require you to believe that Germany was not a democracy in World War One,
Yeah.
and so that is arguable. So of course you can always change the terms. You can always change stuff.
Yeah.
But it is a striking thesis. I was amazed when I read that.
Mm-hmm.
And as it was by a historian, I didn't feel I could challenge it. As a mere philosopher, I wouldn't know.
But I think there is
Yeah.
something here that's actually quite fundamental, and that is that in holding on to the international rules-based order, we defend certain things. We defend our democracy, we defend Ukraine, we defend what we believe of as human rights. But in this moment, we find that the bully is coming from both sides. It's both Russia and America, and in that sense, we don't know yet in what direction America will develop. All the signs are that it's not a particularly democratic direction, but it's too early maybe to form the conclusion about what then the end point of that will be. But that said, I think, for those who will think of this as foundational to common public life in Europe, there are some very big questions to be answered about how does this relate to the way that we think of human rights in Europe and outside of Europe. Who is the arbiter of this? Who is the enforcer of that? And is it even possible to do that? And if that's not the case, which is the most probable case, then how do we orient ourselves again to a changing international reality? And I think that's maybe the biggest question here, of which my book is really just a small piece of that. But I think we need to start thinking about what this will look like in 20, 30 and 50 years, not just next year. And I think that is speaking again of those temporal lenses, we're so used to looking at what happened yesterday in politics and what might happen tomorrow. But actually what we are risking losing is the very structures that have upheld our democracies, our human rights. And it's not just whether one is liberal or not, it's much more fundamental than that.
So I have a question, but I want to give the floor to anybody who has a question. Yes, here.
I wanted to briefly ask I just wanted to ask if the book or yourself had reflected on the role of subnational constitutional orders and the role that they play in kind of othering. I think my experience as an Australian is often no one pays attention to the subnational jurisdictions, and that can often lead those parliaments to get away with things that otherwise would have entered the political discourse in a really strong way.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. There are two ways of entering that question, and I think one is to look at it from the structure of how does sort of the higher structure relate to the substructure. I think in my study of what goes on in America, it's not part of this book. I wanted to write a book about Europe, and now I kind of half regret not having written a proper chapter on America as well. But what you see there is that a lot of the conflicts that play out at the level of Washington were already raging for decades at the state level. What we're seeing now is not new. It's some of this discontent brought to Washington, and I think there's something particular about the Trump moment that has facilitated that. But the grudges about this go all the way back to the 50s and the 60s, and it's intergenerational. It's not just of we think now of as old or young. It goes through families, through generations, through geographical areas. And I think what is important to see perhaps is that most of the questions of coexistence play out at a local level, not even at the subnational level. But it is at that inability to navigate these differences at the local level that propel these issues at the subnational and then later at the national level. And I think we have to be honest about that. The problem is not can we find the right federal answer to this, but can we find new ways of coexisting. So that is one entry into this. Another entry into this is to look at how the question of coexistence is also different between different regions. So I think, I grew up in the Netherlands, so if I think of the Netherlands, people often talk about Amsterdam, it's all liberal, you can, get drugs there, how exciting and whatnot. Not that I would ever, do such things. I came from what is called the Bible Belt. This was a no-go for us, right? So there are very clear sort of distinctions between these areas. And what people would say as well, but our town is Christian. We've got all these churches. Whatever Amsterdam is doing, that's sort of, you know, that's their problem. But we are doing our own thing here. And I think we sometimes, when we talk about what is the majority, locally this does look differently. But who has the majority in the cities often looks different from who is more or less in a majority in the semi-periphery or even in the periphery of these economic sort of spaces. And I think our understanding of what this means for making legislation that is general, so, you know, applies across the board, is that it's more or less blind to these regional differences. And it means that some of the concerns, you know, again, I try to look at these spaces with as much sympathy as I can, because I think it's really important not to go into these polarized conversations. But if you are part of a Christian community like that, and some people in the cities come up with concerns about inclusion that either feel irrelevant or a bit awkward or not quite expressive of the local problems, you're going to feel like, well, these people are imposing things on us. You're going to feel like, you know, why are they not caring about my problems? Are they caring about my problems? And you might even think that, you know, it's not just they are doing their own thing. You might even think that it's important to continue building your local bulwarks of your identity. And that sort of countercultural backlash to the liberal project is very much what I grew up with. Like, I've seen it, I've lived it, it's something I had to also come to terms with as I, you know, moved in different countries and had different experiences. But I think we have to be really mindful that what the Constitution is trying to do is not to give necessarily these general answers, but to help people locally come to agreements that might still be begrudged or a bit awkward, but at least, you know, to work out what it looks like to live together. And I think that is what we might possibly need to go back to. Like, how do we make sense of these differences? How does the Constitution facilitate that without losing sight of everyone's rights, but without making everything about the culture wars? Because that's what we've made people buy into. And I don't think it's a good story.
And I want to loop this back to the earlier point that the law is being used to settle everything, and the awkward conversations are not happening. They're being pushed to the courts, and how unhelpful that's been.
So my question was to try to link something that Joe said to where Naz, you ended. And Joe, what I heard you saying was that there are leaders on the right that are using the language of liberalism to pursue projects that are not fundamentally liberal. But those leaders are, in the cases that you have chronicled in this book, put into power by people who voted for them. And so, Naz, your, I think, closing question was, what's driving the voters to, and is it, I think you said, is it insecurity? So there's, you know, so I think, and there's a nice link to where you just ended, Marietta, which is there are people who feel that this language resonates. And why is it resonating now in a new way? Why now, right? Because we have seen, really beginning with the 2014 election of Modi, a wave of this across the globe that's been, you know, very amply chronicled by places like VDEM and Freedom House. You know, there's a real democratic recession. You know, it's driven in many places by people voting those politicians into power. So what is your sense from the people you're speaking to, even in these 4 countries, about what is driving that?
I think there's 2 things. If I go sort of from the analytical lens, which is slightly top down, is that there is a very clever use of certain topics among the right. So the example that I often give when I talk to churches about this topic is some churches might, you know, have reservations about abortion. Fine, that has been part of their theology for a very long time. But the reason that they have for that is very different from your extreme right sort of, you know, argument against abortion. That's about the reproduction of, say, the white nation. And what happens in these moments where you say, oh, we don't think abortion is good, or maybe, you know, the rules should be tightened, is that different constituencies can buy into that for completely different reasons. And I think that whether it is LGBT rights or abortion or liberalism or, there's all these sort of catchwords that make it appear like there is such a clear liberal-illiberal divide. In reality, there isn't, but these bridge frames are very, very effectively used by the radical right. And it is not just nationally, it's also transnationally. So you see the same topics emerge, whether it's in Central Europe, in Western Europe, you see it in Latin America, you see them pop up in Russia, you see them pop up in America and elsewhere. These are intentional networks and also underpinned by transnational organizations that will engage in legal advocacy, that will engage in political advocacy, might engage in public campaigns. So there is an element to which this is highly organized, it is very well conceived of, and it's something that's very well funded, whether it is from funding within these countries or funding that comes from other directions, often America or Russia. This, it's not limited to that, but those are two important sources. So I think that is something that ordinary people that I speak with are not always aware of. One, because a lot of these organizations have a public face and then they have other activities, so it's not always obvious, and they might even say, well, we're doing this Christian thing, give us money, pray for us, we're doing this really important thing, and then they also do have other activities as well. So I think that is something that is not obvious for ordinary voters. But I think the other thing is that lots of voters, and that's not limited to conservative Christians by any means, is that they feel like politics don't care about them. It's not, there's lots of local issues that we're not addressing. We are talking about the culture wars as if that's our biggest problem, but it's masking that we're not showing the capacity to actually resolve other problems, and it eats people up from the inside. I think we have to be honest about that, and maybe the answer to that will go past the left-right sort of divide here, because actually that's not what's fundamental here. We all need roads, we all need sewerage, we all want clean water coming out of the tap. There's a lot of things that we assume are there, but what if nobody is responsible? And that's what we see in America now, with entire departments being weeded out to the point where basic services are not actually delivered. And that's what people realize, that, we knew government was about more than negotiating these cultural conflicts. So I hope that will lead to a new appreciation for what collective action can do, whether in the form of state or in other forms of collective action. But I think, some sense of that actually politics is caring about everyday problems is fundamental to this discontent that we're seeing today.
Great. So,
just a quick one. How do you think just a comment on the structure of the media, particularly the last handful of years, like 5 or 6 years, has helped or hindered governments to, the spin that, and you really don't know what is the truth, and they can manipulate things there. Where 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was a different playing field, wasn't it?
I mean, there's several things here. Like, one is what's happening with public media, the funding of public media, the independence of public media. But I think, when I was traveling to America, you had, I would walk into some people's living rooms and it was Fox News on all day, and I would walk into other living rooms and it was CNN all day, and there was very little overlap between this. I think what we have seen in Hungary is that actually a lot of the media have been bought by allies of the Fidesz government, so it's incredibly difficult to get a message out if you're not pro-Fidesz. I think the total airtime of the main candidate in the last elections was 15 minutes on public television, as opposed to hours and hours and hours of Fidesz. I think we have seen something very similar in Russia, where the media has been, captured to such a degree where opposition is not just small, but also on the active threat. I think that's something that we have to take very seriously, because when we want voters to take independent decisions, they need to have access to some, somewhat reliable information. But it's not just those channels. It's the much bigger thing here, I think, is social media and the way in which political advertising, non-political advertising is weaponized. we look, for example, at Russia a lot, but Hungary engages in this as well. So they had their own campaigns aimed at Italy, Belgium, Germany, Slovakia, Poland. And that was all uncovered by independent journalists from V-Square in Central Eastern Europe. Up until recently, part funded by USAID. So, big question about what will happen with them. But I think we have to admit that our information playing field is not level. And I think we are at the back foot, really, across Europe on how to deal with this. I think Romania, the elections, the presidential elections, they are leading to cancellation of the outcome, and then the reorganization of these elections and the shutting out of one candidate was because of undisclosed use of these foreign agents who are trying to influence the public opinion in Romania. At least the Romanian highest court drew a line and said, well, we're not going to do it that way. That will maybe help. That will maybe be a remedy as a one-off, but that's not a structural solution to what is a very, very structural and foundational problem. And I think we will see many more election cycles that this disinformation will shape more and more what the outcome of these elections will look like. And very little of this is controlled from within our own territories. A lot of it comes from Russia, but also a lot of these, tech companies are based in America. There's no guarantee that the weeding out of disinformation or any sense of what is in the public interest of these countries, irrespective of what one votes for, is of any concern.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick side note on that, as many of you will be aware, India and Pakistan recently had a very, scary moment of conflict over Kashmir. And my reading of that, Tarun, I don't know, you may have something to say on this, but it was really interesting to read what the Indian media was saying, which had very little, mainstream media, very little bearing on actually what was transpiring on the ground, disputed as it may be. And I've heard the first rumblings of people discussing how problematic that was. And there was such a slow creep, and it wasn't actually, social media penetration very high. You do have different channels that people listen to. But what has happened in India is that there's been a very, a movement towards consolidation of media networks and ownership in hands that are very, very closely tied to the Modi regime. And that caused India to drop about 25 points in the Reporters Without Freedom Index. So those structures of control matter too. And it's only at this recent moment of crisis that there's real awareness, I think, of what has been lost in the last decade in terms of the ability of the media to really speak freely and not to serve as a mouthpiece for the government. But a really interesting area of research then is how does one recover what has been lost? And what are the pathways that that's actually happened in societies? And I think that's an interesting area for future research. But we are out of time, so let me draw it to a close. And please join me in thanking not only Marietta, but our wonderful discussants, but especially Marietta for giving us such a wonderful book.